Another story from my ancient book, Uncle Arthur's Bedtime Stories. And this book has been in my family for a very long time. My mother read it to me, and I read it to my kids, and my kids have read it to their kids. So it's been here a really long time. How Lazy Laurie became Mother's helper. I wouldn't like to say out loud that Laurie was lazy, but perhaps he'd be very much offended, and I don't like to offend anybody, but I'm afraid that was the truth. No matter what it was that you asked Laurie to do, he'd always reply, "I can't." For every job he seemed to have an excuse. You asked him to bring in a scuttle of coal, he'd say, "I can't, it's too heavy." Or if you asked him to go on an errand, he'd say, "I can't, I'm too tired." Perhaps you'd ask him to wipe the dishes, then he'd say, "I can't, that's a girl's job." Of course, there was nothing at all in any of his excuses, and I'm quite sure that the real trouble with Laurie was just pure, utter laziness. You see, he said, "I can't," only when there was work to be done. He never said it at playtime, or when his friend came to the door and asked him to go bicycling or to play ball, and it was always, "All right, I'll be ready in a moment." Laurie's mother told him many times that it wasn't fair that he never helped the least bit in the work of the home, and yet was so ready to run off and play. But Laurie was the same as ever the next day, and all Mother had said did not seem to make any difference. But one day his mother had a brilliant idea. The next morning Laurie stayed in bed so long that he was late for school. Usually Mother would call him in good time, only to be answered by a dozy, "I can't get up, I'm sleepy." And this morning Mother let Laurie get up when he liked, and that was very late indeed. He was cross when he came downstairs and wanted to have his breakfast immediately. But there was none for him. "Why didn't you get my breakfast?" he asked. "I can't," said Mother, with a curious smile. "I'm so tired." Very angry, Laurie ran off to school without any breakfast. He was so late that teacher scolded him in front of the class, which made him crosser still. On the way home he climbed a fence with some other boys, and coming down found himself hooked on a rusty nail. He managed to get down at last, but left part of his trousers on the top of the fence. And when he got home he wanted Mother to mend them at once. "I can't," said Mother, "I'm too busy." "And have I got to go to school like this?" asked Laurie, pointing to the hole in his trousers. "I'm afraid so," said Mother. And go he had to, greatly to the amusement of all the other girls and boys. When Laurie got back from school, of course he wanted his supper at once, for he had not had much to eat that day. But there was nothing on the table. He was greatly surprised, for he'd been used to finding everything ready for him. "You haven't got the supper ready, Mother," he said. "No," said Mother quite disinterestedly, "I can't. I'm tired, and the dinner dishes aren't washed yet." "But I want to go out and play directly after supper," said Laurie. "All right," said Mother, not stirring from her armchair and looking at the book she was reading. "I don't mind. But aren't you going to get me any supper? I can't. I'm tired." Laurie stormed out of the house and slammed the door. But as he was going down the street, he began to think things over. Perhaps Mother was tired after all. Perhaps she really did need someone to help her. Perhaps she really was too tired to get her own supper ready. Laurie stopped. He thought of the game of ball that he was going to enjoy, then of his mother sitting at home too tired to get her own supper. He began to feel sorry that he'd been so cross. He would go back. Peeking through the kitchen window, Laurie saw that his mother had gone to sleep in her armchair. At once he realised that this was his opportunity to make things right, because at heart he really was a good little boy, even though he had a very strong tendency to laziness where work was concerned. Creeping into the kitchen on tiptoe, he washed up the dishes as silently as he could, and then still more quietly crept into the dining room and laid the table. To be quite frank, this was the first time for many months that Laurie had laid the table, but he made a fine job of it. He put out all the nicest things he could find and brought in some flowers from the garden, and altogether made the table look as though someone extra special was coming for supper. Then he noticed that he'd forgotten to bring in the butter dish, and he went to fetch it. Unfortunately, it was a little greasy, and it slipped out of his hand. Ooh!
It's not cold. It's fine. Keep reading. That's okay.
It slipped out of his hand, falling with a crash to the floor. Mother awoke and jumped out of her chair as though something dreadful had happened. She'd been dreaming about Laurie, and the noise had come just as he'd been getting into trouble. But her fears were turned to joy when she saw the neatly set table. "Well," she exclaimed, "who would have believed it, that you could set a table so nicely?" They had a lovely meal together, and Mother never said a word about the broken butter dish. Laurie was so happy that he determined that he really would help Mother more after this. Just as they were finishing supper, there was a knock at the door, and a boy's voice called out, "Come on, Laurie, we're all waiting for you." "Sorry, I can't come," said Laurie. "I'm going to help Mother this evening." But Mother overheard, and she came running to the door. "It's all right, Laurie, this time. You can help me tomorrow." Overjoyed, Laurie ran off, and that was the best game of football he had ever played. Got me